The ocean floor off Japan cracked open on April 20th, 2026. A magnitude 7.7 earthquake, tsunami warnings across 2 entire coastlines. And then something happened that scared scientists even more than the shaking itself. The aftershocks stopped. The ground went quiet. And that silence is the part that keeps seismologists up at night. We are going to walk through what is building beneath Japan right now, from missing aftershocks to a fault with a 90% chance of snapping, to waves taller than a 10-story building. If you enjoy the journey, subscribe and leave a like. Let's go. The ocean floor cracked open at 4:32 in the morning, local time, on April 20th, 2026. Japan's northeastern coast had been through earthquakes before. The country sits on one of the most unstable strips of land on the planet. Its people grow up doing drills. They keep go bags by their doors. They know the sound of the emergency alert before it even finishes loading on their phones. But this one was different from the first second. A magnitude 7.7 earthquake detonated offshore between the islands of Hokkaido and Iwate. To put that in terms you can actually picture, the energy released was roughly equivalent to 30,000 nuclear bombs going off at once, all of it focused on a single point beneath the seafloor. The ground didn't just shake, it lurched. Buildings swayed, dishes shattered, people grabbed door frames and held on. Within minutes, the Japan Meteorological Agency broadcast tsunami warnings across 2 entire coastlines. Sirens screamed through fishing towns and port cities. Residents who had rehearsed this moment hundreds of times grabbed their bags and ran uphill. Emergency services flooded the airwaves with one instruction repeated over and over: get to high ground, now. The first waves arrived smaller than feared. That was the first strange detail. Coastal monitors recorded surges, but nothing close to what a 7.7 offshore quake typically produces. People watching the data breathed for a moment. Maybe the seafloor geometry had softened the blow. Maybe the angle of the rupture had directed the energy downward instead of outward. The Japan Meteorological Agency did not breathe. Their instruments told a more complicated story. The wave behavior was irregular. The timing between surges was off. And something about the way energy was moving through the fault zone made their models flash warnings that had nothing to do with what was already in the water. They issued a statement that stood out from standard earthquake language. They said the initial wave might not be the most dangerous. They said the geological event was far from over. That sentence landed differently on scientists than it did on the general public. For a regular person, far from over means more shaking is coming, more aftershocks, more small jolts as the Earth settles back down. That is the normal sequence. Everyone who lives in a seismically active region understands that rhythm. A big quake happens, then smaller ones follow, then smaller ones after that. The Earth releases pressure in steps like a fist slowly unclenching. For a seismologist, far from over can mean something else entirely. It can mean the fault did not finish what it started. It can mean the pressure is still locked in. It can mean the 7.7 was a setup. The agency knew they had to watch the next 36 hours with every sensor they had. Around Japan, coastal communities stayed in evacuation shelters. Train services remained suspended on several lines. Nuclear facility operators ran through their inspection checklists for the second time that morning. Emergency managers kept their phones on loud. The country had survived this before. It had rebuilt before. It carried the memory of 2011 in its bones, in its building codes, in its warning systems, in the faces of anyone old enough to remember the wave that erased entire towns from the map. They waited for the aftershocks to arrive and tell them it was over. The aftershocks never came. And that changed everything. 36 hours after the magnitude 7.7 earthquake, something was wrong with the data. A team of seismologists at the Japan Meteorological Agency sat watching their screens. The numbers were supposed to climb, then gradually fall. That is the pattern. That is how it always works. A major earthquake ruptures a fault, and the surrounding rock adjusts to the new stress. Those adjustments show up as aftershocks, dozens of them, sometimes hundreds. They crowd the charts in the first 24 hours, slowly thinning out like the tail of a comet. The charts were nearly flat. The largest follow-up tremors recorded were far weaker than the models predicted, and the smaller background tremors, the ones that fill in the gaps and signal that the fault is exhaling, were almost invisible. The seismic network was sensitive enough to detect a magnitude 1.0 quake anywhere in the region. It was picking up almost nothing. Scientists have a word for what they were looking at. They call it seismic quiescence. Quiescence means quiet, and in earthquake science, quiet after a major strike is a red flag, not a relief. Picture a compressed spring. You push it down hard, then let go. A normal spring bounces back in a series of visible, measurable jumps. Now imagine you push that spring down hard and it just sits there, perfectly still without bouncing. You would not think the tension was gone. You would think something was holding it in place. And the longer it held, the more worried you would get about what happens when it finally releases. That is the image the seismologists had in their heads as they stared at the flat charts. The 36-hour mark was significant because it fell inside the agency's own internal threshold for concern. They had modelled hundreds of major earthquakes and tracked their aftershock sequences. They knew what a healthy decay curve looked like. This sequence was far outside the healthy range. The agency called an internal review. They cross-checked the sensor data against backup networks. They ruled out equipment failure. They ruled out a data processing glitch. The readings were accurate. What they were seeing was real geological silence, and it was happening in a fault zone that had just released the energy of 30,000 nuclear bombs. The question on every scientist's mind had two possible answers, and one of them was far worse than the other. The first possibility: the fault had released its stress in an unusual way, without generating the standard aftershock sequence. This happens sometimes. The rock geometry, the depth of the rupture, or the specific stress configuration can occasionally produce a quieter recovery. Unusual, but survivable. The second possibility was harder to say out loud. The 7.7 magnitude quake had only broken a small, isolated section of the fault. The surrounding rock, still locked and still loaded with decades of accumulated pressure, had not moved at all. The absence of aftershocks meant the stress had nowhere to go. And a fault loaded with that much unspent energy, sitting completely still, was a fault preparing for something much larger. In earthquake science, that second scenario has a name. It is called a foreshock sequence. A foreshock is a quake that comes before the real one. And the silence sitting over Japan's northeast coast fit the pattern almost perfectly. The agency had seen something like this before. Most of Japan had. The memory of it was embedded in national trauma, connected to a single date that every person in the country knows by heart. That date was March 11th, 2011. And the parallels were beginning to stack up in ways that nobody wanted to acknowledge out loud. To understand why the missing aftershocks matter so much, you need to understand what normally happens inside a fault after a major rupture. A fault is a crack in the Earth's crust where two massive slabs of rock press against each other. These slabs are always moving, grinding slowly in opposite directions at roughly the speed your fingernails grow. Over years, then decades, the friction between them builds up stress the way a twisted rubber band builds tension. The rock locks, the pressure accumulates, and then, when the stress finally overcomes the friction, the fault slips. That slip is an earthquake, but the slip rarely releases all the stored energy at once. The main rupture breaks one section of the fault, and the surrounding rock, suddenly thrown off balance, begins adjusting. Those adjustments are aftershocks. They radiate outward from the main break in a predictable pattern, growing weaker and less frequent over time, following a mathematical curve that seismologists figured out over a century ago. A Japanese scientist named Fusakichi Omori worked out the basic formula in 1894. His rule, known as Omori's law, describes how aftershock frequency decays over time. The rate drops fast at first, then slows gradually. A major earthquake can technically produce aftershocks for years, but most of the energy releases in the first 48 hours. That early window is when the charts should be crowded with activity. Seismologists use this curve as a health check. If the data follows Amori's law, the fault is exhaling normally. If the data falls below the curve, something is off. Think of it like a bruise. When you take a hard hit, the skin around the impact point swells and throbs as blood rushes to the area. That response is the body's normal signal that it took damage and is working through it. Now imagine taking a hard hit and feeling nothing at all. No swelling, no throbbing. Just silence. A doctor would tell you that silence is the concerning outcome, because it might mean the damage went somewhere deeper. After the April 26 quake, the fault's aftershock curve fell far below Amori's predicted line. The drop was visible within the first 12 hours and worsened by hour 36. The largest recorded follow-up tremors were significantly weaker than models projected, and the background tremor rate, those tiny micro quakes that normally fill the chart like static noise, was almost absent. This meant one of two things for the fault's internal stress budget. Either the main quake had released pressure in an unusual distributed way that left the surrounding rock undisturbed. This sometimes happens when the rupture spreads slowly along a wider section of fault instead of snapping sharply at a single point. Or the main rupture had been geologically small and shallow, breaking only a localized snag in an otherwise locked fault. In that case, the surrounding rock was still loaded, still frozen under enormous pressure, and still waiting for something to release it. The instruments could not tell the difference between these two scenarios from the outside. Both produced the same flat chart. Both looked identical on the seismograph. The only way to know which scenario was real was to keep watching. And while scientists watched, the clock kept moving. Because in Japan's seismic history, periods of unusual calm after a moderate earthquake have sometimes preceded something catastrophic. The next chapter in Japan's history was written in 2011, and the way it started looked almost exactly like this. On the morning of April 21st, 2026, the Japan Meteorological Agency did something it almost never does. It activated a rare advisory protocol tied specifically to anomalous aftershock behavior. This protocol is not a standard earthquake warning. Japan issues those regularly. This was something different. It was a 72-hour window of heightened monitoring and public alertness, triggered when observed aftershock patterns fall outside the expected range following a major strike. The agency does not use this protocol often. In the years since Japan built its current seismic monitoring network, this level of advisory has been reserved for a handful of situations where the data looked genuinely wrong in ways that could not be explained by normal fault behavior. Activating it is an institutional acknowledgement that current conditions fall outside standard models. For the public, the advisory translated into a set of blunt instructions. Stay within reach of your emergency kit. Know your evacuation route. If you live on the coast, understand where the nearest high ground is and how long it takes you to get there on foot. Do not assume the shaking is finished. For scientists, the advisory meant something more specific. The pattern of missing aftershocks was serious enough that the agency could not rule out a scenario where the April quake had been a foreshock. The 72-hour window was the critical observation period, because historical data shows that if a larger event follows a foreshock, it most often arrives within that window. Most often. The word most carries enormous weight in a sentence like that. A seismologist who studies foreshock sequences would tell you that the relationship between foreshocks and main events is one of the least predictable areas in the entire field. You can identify a foreshock sequence with high confidence only after the larger quake has already happened. Before that moment, you are working with probability, not certainty. What the agency could say with confidence was this: the pattern of missing aftershocks matched the patterns recorded before several major earthquakes in Japan's history. Matching a pattern is not a guarantee, but it is a reason to act, and the agency acted. The 72 hours that followed were tense in a quiet, grinding way. Coastal residents in Hokkaido and Iwate stayed closer to home. Evacuation shelters in several towns remained partially staffed. Emergency broadcast systems ran regular check-in tones to confirm they were live and ready. Scientists ran the sensor data through updated stress models, trying to determine how much unspent energy might still be locked in the fault. The numbers came back with wide uncertainty ranges. That is the honest answer when a fault behaves outside its expected pattern. The models widen, the error bars grow, the confidence shrinks. 72 hours passed. No massive follow-up quake arrived. The advisory window closed. But the agency was careful in how it communicated that closure. It said the immediate elevated risk period had ended. It did not say the fault had returned to normal. It did not say the missing aftershocks had been explained. The scientists were still watching the same flat charts, still waiting for the fault to tell them which of the two scenarios was real. Because the alternative to a stabilizing fault was still on the table, and just a few hundred miles to the south, a completely separate geological system was building towards something that made the April quake look like a warning shot. Of all the concepts in earthquake science, foreshocks are the most psychologically brutal. A foreshock is a real earthquake. It shakes buildings. It triggers warnings. It sends people running for safety. It measures on the scale and causes genuine damage. And then, days or even hours later, a larger earthquake arrives and reveals that the first one was a preview. The cruel part is that you cannot identify a foreshock while it is happening. You can only recognize one after the main event has already struck. Before that moment, a foreshock looks identical to a regular earthquake. The same waveform on the seismograph, the same shaking pattern on the surface, the same data in every respect. Scientists have spent decades trying to build a system that could flag foreshocks in real time. The closest they have come is a set of statistical warning signs, clusters of small quakes before a larger one, unusual ground deformation patterns, changes in the water levels of deep wells. But none of these signals are reliable enough to trigger a public warning on their own. The missing aftershock pattern following the April quake added a new layer to this problem. In a typical foreshock scenario, the initial quake breaks a small, isolated patch of a larger fault. Because the break is small, it does not release much of the surrounding stress, and therefore the aftershock sequence is weaker than you would expect for its magnitude. The surrounding fault stays locked. The energy keeps building. This matches, almost point for point, what seismologists observed in the days after April 20th, 2026. Globally, studies of historical earthquake sequences show that roughly 5 to 10% of major earthquakes are later identified as foreshocks. That sounds like a small number. Put it another way, 1 in 10 major earthquakes is a preview of something worse. On a planet where major earthquakes strike every few weeks, that is a recurring nightmare playing out somewhere in the world at regular intervals. Japan's historical record makes the probability feel even heavier. The country sits at the intersection of 4 tectonic plates. Major earthquakes there are frequent enough that the statistical odds of any given large quake being a foreshock are higher than the global average simply because the fault systems are more complex and more interconnected. The scientific community in Japan was running that math in the days after April 20th. They were also running a second, grimmer set of calculations. If the April quake had released energy from a small, localized segment of the fault, then the surrounding segments were still fully loaded. The stress that had been accumulating for years, maybe decades, was still stored in the rock, and a fault segment that stays locked after a neighbouring section breaks is a fault segment under increased strain, because the shift changes the stress distribution across the entire system. In mechanical terms, it is like pulling one brick from the base of a wall. The bricks around it suddenly carry more weight. Japan's northeastern fault zone was carrying more weight. The question every scientist wanted answered was whether the wall would hold. And for anyone who remembered the spring of 2011, the answer that history offered was not comforting. On March 9th, 2011, a magnitude 7.2 earthquake struck the same northeastern region of Japan where the April 26 quake had just hit. At the time, seismologists noted it. Emergency managers filed their reports. The public felt the shaking and checked their homes for cracks. Aftershocks followed in the expected pattern. The fault appeared to be exhaling normally. 2 days later, on March 11th, a magnitude 9.0 earthquake tore open the seafloor along a 300-mile stretch of the same fault system. The rupture lasted 6 minutes. The ground near the epicenter shifted by up to 80 feet horizontally in a matter of seconds. The seafloor lifted by several feet across an area larger than the state of California. The tsunami that followed was not a wave in any normal sense. It was a wall of water between 30 and 130 feet tall, moving inland at the speed of a commercial jet at lower altitude, carrying cars, houses, fishing boats, and everything else in its path. It struck 1,600 miles of coastline. It killed nearly 20,000 people. It caused 3 nuclear reactors to melt down. The 7.2 earthquake 2 days before was the foreshock. Nobody knew it at the time. This is the event that sits in the back of every Japanese seismologist's mind when they look at the post-April 26 data. The parallel is not perfect. The fault zones are not identical. The depths, the plate configurations, and the accumulated stress levels differ in ways that matter scientifically. But the broad shape of the sequence is uncomfortably similar. A major offshore quake, weaker than expected aftershocks, a period of unusual seismic quiet, and then, in 2011, catastrophe. Japan's government is keenly aware of this parallel. Officials are careful about how they discuss it publicly, because the goal is to keep people alert without triggering a panic that would itself cause harm. That balance is extraordinarily hard to strike when the historical template for the current situation is the deadliest natural disaster the country has experienced in a generation. Scientists are equally careful. They stress the differences between the two sequences whenever they speak publicly. They note that the April 26 quake occurred on a different fault segment than the 2011 foreshock. They note that monitoring technology has improved dramatically since 2011. The improved monitoring is real and meaningful. Japan's seismic network now covers the seafloor with sensors that did not exist 15 years ago. The country has more GPS ground deformation stations, more deep borehole sensors, and faster data processing than at any previous point in its history. Scientists today have a far richer picture of what is happening underground than their colleagues had in 2011. And what that richer picture is showing them right now is a fault zone that is behaving strangely, sitting quietly under enormous accumulated stress, with its aftershock sequence running far below what the models predict. The ghost of 2011 is not a certainty. It is a warning shape on a map that has already come true once before, and somewhere beneath Japan's northeastern coastline, the fault is still deciding what it wants to do next. To understand what is at stake, you need a clear picture of what the 2011 Tohoku earthquake actually did. The magnitude 9.0 rupture stands as one of the most powerful earthquakes ever recorded in human history. It ranks in the top 5 globally. On the Richter scale, the difference between a magnitude 7 and a magnitude 9 sounds like 2 steps. The math is far more extreme. Each whole number on the scale represents roughly 32 times more energy released. A magnitude 9 releases approximately 1,000 times more energy than a magnitude 7. The April 26 7.7 earthquake was enormous. The 2011 event dwarfed it. The rupture began 60 miles offshore and spread along the fault at roughly 2 miles per second. The shaking lasted around 6 minutes in some areas, which is an eternity compared to the 30 to 60 seconds most large earthquakes produce. Buildings designed to survive intense shaking for a short burst were tested far beyond their design limits. Entire towns on Japan's northeastern coast were built behind massive concrete seawalls, some of them 30 feet tall, constructed specifically to block tsunamis. the 2011 wave simply topped them, pouring over the edges like water over a bathtub rim. In some coastal valleys, the water funneled inland and amplified, reaching heights of 130 feet above sea level. Trees were stripped of their bark by the force of the flow. The Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant lost power to its cooling systems when the wave destroyed the backup generators. 3 reactors overheated, 3 reactors melted down. The cleanup process is still ongoing as of today, 15 years later. The economic damage from the Tohoku disaster exceeded $200 billion, making it the costliest natural disaster in recorded history at that point. And this is the benchmark. This is the scale of event that seismologists think about when they look at a flat aftershock chart in the same region. Japan rebuilt after Tohoku. It raised seawalls higher. It revised its building codes. It moved some coastal communities to higher ground entirely. The rebuilt seawalls along some sections of the coast now stand 60 feet tall, taller than a 5-story building, stretching for miles along the shoreline like a concrete fortress. But rebuilding is not the same as preventing. The tectonic forces that produced Tohoku are still operating. The plates are still moving. The fault system that ruptured in 2011 reloads with stress over time, just as it loaded before the 2011 event. The cycle continues regardless of what humans build on the surface above it. The ghost of Tohoku does not haunt Japan as a past event only. It stands as a reference point for what a worst-case scenario looks like on this specific stretch of fault. And the April 2026 situation is being measured against that reference point every day by scientists who remember exactly what the data looked like in the spring of 2011. What comes next is not a repeat of Tohoku. Japan's current threat runs on 2 separate timelines, one north, one south, and the southern one is written into the geological record as an almost mathematical certainty. When the 2011 earthquake tore open the seafloor, something happened that most people never heard about in the immediate aftermath. The earthquake was so powerful that it shifted the position of Earth's rotational axis. Scientists confirmed this using a global network of GPS stations and satellite measurements. The axis shifted by roughly 10 inches. That means the imaginary line running through the centre of the planet from pole to pole moved its position by about the length of a standard ruler. To most people, this sounds like a fact that belongs in a science class but has no real-world consequences. For physicists who study planetary mechanics, it is a different kind of number entirely. The Earth's rotation is a finely tuned system. The planet spins because of the angular momentum built up when it formed 4.5 billion years ago, and that spin has been maintained and adjusted ever since by the distribution of mass across the planet's interior. When a massive amount of material moves suddenly, as it does during a megaquake, the distribution of mass changes and the axis responds. The 2011 shift was small enough that it had no effect on day-to-day life. Clocks did not need resetting. Seasons did not shift. The change was detectable only with precision instruments. But the fact that a geological event could move the axis of the entire planet by 10 inches tells you something important about the scale of forces involved. A magnitude 9 earthquake does not just shake a country, it physically reshapes a section of the planet. The seafloor near the Tohoku epicenter permanently rose in some places by several feet and sank in others. The Japanese island of Honshu, the main island, moved approximately 8 feet to the east in a matter of minutes. The coastline geometry of northeastern Japan changed permanently. Maps had to be redrawn. This is what awaits any major fault system when it finally lets go. The Nankai Trough, Japan's southern subduction zone, has been accumulating stress for over 70 years since its last major rupture. The plates grinding against each other, they're storing energy across a fault length of more than 600 miles. The scale of a potential Nankai rupture would be in the same magnitude range as Tohoku, possibly exceeding it depending on how much of the fault breaks at once. Scientists have run the simulations. The ground deformation models for a full Nankai rupture show seafloor uplift and subsidence patterns similar to 2011, spread across a wider area. The axis shift that would follow a Nankai event is likely to match or exceed what happened in 2011. The planet would move again. The coast would change. The maps would need to be redrawn again. Understanding the physical scale of what these fault systems can produce is essential background for understanding why the December 2025 earthquake, the one that struck the Aomori region just months before the April 26 event, set off a separate set of alarm bells. Because that quake came with a detail that, in any other country, might have been contained in a footnote. In Japan, it required immediate government attention. 4 months before the April strike, Japan got a warning shot that many people outside the country barely noticed. On December 8th, 2025, a magnitude 7.5 earthquake hit off the coast of Aomori Prefecture in the far northern part of Japan's main island. The quake struck at a depth of 31 miles underground. That depth matters. A shallow quake at 7.5 would have been catastrophic. At 31 miles down, the energy had more rock to travel through before reaching the surface, which reduced the surface shaking intensity. Still, the effects were severe enough. Power went out across thousands of homes. Roads cracked. Infrastructure took damage across a wide area. Emergency services across Aomori mobilized immediately. More than 90,000 residents in the northeastern region received official evacuation orders. 90,000 people. That is roughly the population of a mid-size American city. Everyone in something like Knoxville, Tennessee, suddenly ordered to leave their homes and head to shelters. 34 people were injured in the December quake. Considering the magnitude, that number reflects Japan's extraordinary preparedness infrastructure. The building codes, the public drills, the early warning systems, the evacuation protocols, all of them working together to keep a 7.5 magnitude event from becoming a mass casualty disaster. Tsunami warnings went out along multiple coastlines following the Aomori strike. Officials issued a separate warning the next day, December 9th, cautioning that a follow-up event of up to magnitude 8.0 was possible in the coming days. That warning reflected the same logic that would play out again in April, a major quake with a weaker than typical aftershock sequence, raising the possibility of a larger follow-up. The follow-up never came at that magnitude in December. The situation gradually stabilized, but the December quake left something behind beyond the cracked roads and the power outages. It left a region of Japan's infrastructure that had taken repeated seismic hits over a short period. Buildings that had absorbed the December shaking were then exposed to the April quake just 4 months later. Seawalls that may have developed microfractures in December faced the April event already slightly weakened. Sequential earthquakes do not just add damage, they compound it. Each strike tests structures that are already carrying the stress of previous events. Engineers call this cumulative fatigue, and it is one of the harder problems to address in disaster preparedness, because you cannot fully inspect every affected structure between events. The December quake also drew attention to something that the April event would amplify into a national conversation. Japan's infrastructure was being tested repeatedly in the same region in a short time window. And one particular detail from the December event made the nuclear safety question impossible to ignore. That detail involved 120 gallons of water, a cooling system, and a facility that processes nuclear fuel. When the December 2025 Aomori earthquake struck, the ground shook beneath a nuclear fuel processing facility in the region. The facility is not a power plant in the traditional sense. It processes spent nuclear fuel, separating usable material from radioactive waste. It is part of the nuclear fuel cycle, and like all nuclear facilities in Japan, it operates under strict seismic safety standards. The shaking from the magnitude 7.5 quake caused a pipe or connection somewhere in the facility's cooling system to fail. 120 gallons of water leaked from the system. 120 gallons sounds like a small number. For context, that is roughly the volume of 2 standard bathtubs. In terms of total water volume at a facility that size, It is a fractional amount. But the significance is not the volume. The significance is that something in the cooling infrastructure moved enough to crack under seismic stress. The fact that the leak was small means the safety margins held this time. It also means the safety margins were tested. Nuclear cooling systems are designed to keep reactor cores and stored fuel assemblies from overheating. When cooling fails, heat builds up. When heat builds up unchecked, fuel can melt. The world has seen what happens at that point twice in Japan alone, once at 3 Mile Island's less severe version, and once, catastrophically, at Fukushima in 2011. The Aomori leak was quickly contained and reported. Japanese nuclear regulators confirmed the facility remained safe and operational. No radioactive material escaped. The cooling function was restored. Officials also confirmed that the decommissioned Fukushima plant, still undergoing its lengthy cleanup process at the time of the December quake, showed no new abnormalities. That confirmation had to be issued because it was the first question the public asked. The name Fukushima carries that kind of weight. But the Aomori leak opened a conversation that the April 26 earthquake made louder. If a magnitude 7.5 could crack a cooling pipe at one facility, what does a magnitude 7.7 do to aging infrastructure across an entire region? And what does a succession of major earthquakes over 4 months do to structural systems that were built to withstand individual events, not repeated sequential battering? The answer involves a concept called cumulative fatigue, and it applies to every bridge, tunnel, seawall, power grid junction, and cooling pipe in northeastern Japan right now. Each quake that does not destroy a structure instead weakens it in ways that are difficult to measure without taking the structure apart. Japan's engineers know this. They have been inspecting, reinforcing, and upgrading infrastructure continuously since 2011. The country spends more per capita on disaster preparedness infrastructure than almost any other nation on Earth. But there is a point where frequency overtakes reinforcement, and as the quakes kept coming through 2025 and into April 2026, that point was getting closer. Meanwhile, the real scale of the threat was coming into focus, because while the world was watching Japan's northeastern coast, the geological system that keeps the country's disaster planners awake every single night was building toward its own inevitable moment, and that system sits to the south. The name Fukushima Daiichi carries a specific weight in every conversation about seismic risk in Japan. The plant was devastated in 2011. 3 of its 6 reactors suffered full meltdowns after the tsunami destroyed the backup generators that were keeping the cooling systems running. The resulting disaster contaminated groundwater, forced the evacuation of over 150,000 people from surrounding communities, and triggered a global reassessment of nuclear safety standards. 15 years later, the cleanup is ongoing. The site is in a state called decommissioning, a process expected to take until at least the 2050s and possibly beyond. Workers are removing melted fuel debris from inside the damaged reactor buildings, a task so dangerous and technically complex that some of it has required remote-controlled robots because the radiation levels are too high for humans to enter directly. As of the mid-2020s, crews were making incremental progress on this extraction, but the timeline keeps extending as unexpected complications arise. The entire site is monitored continuously for radiation levels, groundwater contamination, and structural integrity. When the December 2025 Aomori earthquake struck, regulators immediately ran through the Fukushima status checklist. The confirmation that followed was specific. No new structural damage, no radiation spikes, no changes to the contaminated water management systems. The site was stable. When the April 2026 earthquake hit, the same checklist ran again. The same confirmation came back. That confirmation matters enormously. A damaged nuclear site undergoing active decommissioning is not designed to withstand repeated major seismic events the way an operating plant is. The reactor buildings at Fukushima Daiichi were compromised by the 2011 disaster, and have been structurally reinforced since, but they remain buildings that carry damaged infrastructure inside them. Each major earthquake that passes without incident at Fukushima represents a margin that held. Each margin that holds is genuinely good news, but each one is also a reminder that the margin exists at all, that the situation is stable only within certain parameters, and that those parameters get tested every time the ground moves. Japan's government tracks this closely. The Nuclear Regulation Authority publishes regular reports on the site's status, and those reports have been reviewed with increasing urgency as seismic activity in the region has picked up. The broader nuclear question extends beyond Fukushima. Japan has dozens of nuclear facilities distributed across the archipelago. Following the 2011 disaster, many of the country's operating reactors were shut down for safety reviews. Over the years since, some have been restarted after passing updated regulatory requirements. Others remain offline. Each operating and decommissioning facility sits somewhere within Japan's complex seismic map. Each one has an assigned seismic hazard rating based on its proximity to known fault lines and its structural design specifications. As the earthquake frequency along Japan's northeastern corridor increased through 2025 and 2026, those hazard ratings were under active review. The plants that held through two events, through December and through April, had passed two tests. Whether they were designed to pass a third or a fourth or a fifth under conditions that compound fatigue rather than reset it, is the question that nuclear engineers in Japan are studying right now. And that question exists alongside the geological reality that the most dangerous event in Japan's seismic future has nothing to do with the northeastern faults at all. Before we move south to the Nankai threat, there is one detail about Japan's response to earthquakes that deserves its own moment. Japan's bullet train network is one of the fastest rail systems in the world. The trains run at speeds up to 186 miles per hour. At that speed, a train covers the length of a football field in less than half a second. The network carries millions of passengers per year, running across some of the most seismically active terrain on Earth. The obvious question is, what happens when an earthquake strikes while a bullet train is moving at full speed? Japan answered that question with a system called the Urgent Earthquake Detection and Alarm System, known internally as the Early Warning Network. The system works by detecting the first wave produced by an earthquake, the primary wave, which travels faster than the destructive secondary wave but causes almost no damage on its own. When sensors detect a primary wave above a certain threshold, the system sends an automatic signal to trains in the affected region. Onboard systems apply emergency brakes immediately, without waiting for a human decision. The trains begin decelerating before the destructive shaking even arrives at the surface. The speed difference between the two wave types, the harmless fast wave and the destructive slow wave, gives the system a window of roughly 10 to 30 seconds of warning, depending on the distance from the epicenter. 10 seconds is enough to get a bullet train from full speed to a safer velocity before the violent shaking starts. This system has been credited with preventing major casualties on the rail network during multiple earthquakes, including the 2011 Tohoku event. Trains were slowing or stopped when the severe shaking arrived. The early warning network extends beyond the rail system. Smartphones in Japan receive automatic earthquake alerts through a government broadcast system that pushes notifications to every device in the affected region, sometimes seconds before the shaking reaches the surface. The tone is unmistakable and distinctive, designed to cut through any background noise. These systems are remarkable engineering achievements, and they genuinely save lives, but they operate within limits. The warning window shrinks to near zero for locations directly above the epicenter, and no warning system, no matter how sophisticated, can stop the shaking itself. It can only give people the seconds they need to drop, cover and hold on, or give trains the window to slow down before the wave hits. Japan's preparedness infrastructure is the most advanced in the world. It was built through decades of devastating trial and error, each catastrophe revealing a gap that engineers and emergency planners then work to close. But all of that infrastructure exists within a geological context that sets its own rules. And to the south, below the Pacific Ocean off Japan's central and western coastline, a fault system is loading that no warning system can stop and no seawall fully contains. That system has a name. It is the Nankai Trough, and what is stored inside it right now is the subject of the next chapter. Japan occupies one of the most geologically violent pieces of real estate on the planet. The country sits at the intersection of 4 tectonic plates. The Pacific Plate grinds from the east. The Philippine Sea Plate pushes from the south. The Eurasian Plate and the North American Plate meet beneath the central and northern regions. Japan is pinched between these colossal slabs of rock, each one moving in a different direction, each one generating different stresses along different segments of the fault systems running under the archipelago. The Pacific Ring of Fire is a horseshoe-shaped belt of seismic and volcanic activity that runs around the edges of the Pacific Ocean, from New Zealand up through Japan, across the Aleutian Islands, down the western coast of North America, and around to South America. Roughly 90% of the world's earthquakes occur along or near this belt. Japan alone accounts for about 20% of the world's earthquakes measuring magnitude 6.0 or greater. 20% from a country whose total land area is smaller than the state of California. The reason Japan sits in this position is geological age. The plates that surround Japan have been interacting for tens of millions of years. The subduction zones, the places where one plate dives beneath another, are ancient and deeply set. The fault systems they generate run through the crust in patterns that are well mapped, but still incompletely understood at depth. Subduction is the critical process. Where one plate slides beneath another, the descending plate drags friction along the boundary. That friction locks the plates together in places, preventing smooth, continuous movement and allowing stress to build. The locked zones are called seismic asperities, rough patches on the fault surface that resist slipping until the accumulated pressure finally overcomes them. Japan has multiple major seismic asperities on multiple fault systems at different stages of loading, with different accumulated stress levels and different estimated rupture timelines. The northeastern fault zone is the one that produced the 2011 disaster and is currently exhibiting the anomalous post-April behaviour. The Nankai Trough to the south is a separate system with its own loading history and its own estimated rupture probability. Both systems are active simultaneously. Both are being monitored continuously. Both carry the potential for catastrophic events that would affect not just Japan but the entire Pacific Basin. Understanding the Nankai Trough requires understanding what a subduction zone actually looks like when you strip away the ocean above it and look at the raw geological machinery underneath. Picture 2 cars in a slow-motion collision. One car is moving forward at the speed your hair grows. The other is stationary, or moving in a slightly different direction. The bumpers touch. The pressure between them builds over months, years, decades. The metal bends. The frame absorbs stress. And at some point something gives. The collision that took years to load releases in a fraction of a second. That is a subduction zone, scaled up by a factor of billions. A subduction zone forms where one tectonic plate slides beneath another. The descending plate is usually denser, heavier rock that sinks into the hotter, more fluid rock of the Earth's mantle below. The plate above it stays at the surface. The boundary between them, the subduction interface, is where the action happens. The two plates do not slide past each other smoothly. The boundary is rough. There are ridges, bumps, and irregular patches of rock on both surfaces that catch against each other like Velcro. These caught patches are the asperities. They prevent the plates from moving freely, and so instead of sliding, the plates lock. The pressure keeps building as the plates try to move and cannot. The plate above the descending one does not stay still during this process. The friction drags it downward and inward as the lower plate tries to sink. The overriding plate stretches and bends, storing elastic strain the way a pulled rubber band stores tension. GPS networks can measure this deformation in real time. In the Nankai region, the overriding plate is measurably bending toward the subducting plate by small but detectable amounts every year. When the locked interface finally breaks, both plates snap. The subducting plate lurches forward, the overriding plate springs upward and seaward, releasing all that stored elastic strain at once. The seafloor above lifts suddenly by several feet across potentially hundreds of miles. That rapid uplift pushes the entire water column above it upward simultaneously. That displaced water column is a tsunami. The size of the tsunami depends on how much of the seafloor moves, how quickly it moves, and the geometry of the ocean basin above it. A rupture across a longer section of the fault lifts more seafloor and displaces more water. A faster rupture creates a more powerful initial wave impulse. The Nankai Trough subduction interface runs for more than 600 miles along Japan's southern and central coastline. Scientists have been measuring the strain accumulation in the overriding plate for decades. The measurements confirm what historical records already suggested. The plate is bent, the energy is stored, and the cycle that has produced major earthquakes in this region, roughly every 100 to 150 years throughout recorded history, is overdue. The last full Nankai rupture happened in 1946. That was 80 years ago. There is a way a fault can move without producing a single earthquake. It sounds like a contradiction. Faults move, and when they move, the ground shakes. That is the basic relationship every person who has felt an earthquake understands in their body. But the relationship is more complicated than that. Some faults, or sections of faults, can slip slowly and continuously without locking. The two plates creep past each other at a steady rate, releasing stress gradually rather than storing it up. This process, called aseismic slip or creep, produces no detectable seismic waves and causes no shaking at the surface. From above, you would never know it was happening. The ground feels stable. The sensors detect nothing unusual. Two massive slabs of rock are moving against each other, and the process is completely silent. Aseismic slip is actually the favourable outcome for humans living above a fault. A fault that slips slowly and continuously is a fault that is not building up the catastrophic stress load that produces megaquakes. The slow release keeps the system from reaching the breaking point. The problem is when aseismic slip and locked patches exist on the same fault. A section that creeps releases its stress. A section that is locked does not. The creeping sections can actually increase the strain on the locked patches by pulling on them from both sides, adding to the stress load on the parts that cannot move. This is a known feature of several major fault systems globally, including sections of the Nankai Trough. After the April 2026 earthquake, one of the two competing explanations for the missing aftershocks was aseismic slip. Some seismologists propose that the fault zone around the April rupture might be releasing residual stress through slow, continuous creep rather than through small aftershocks. This would explain the flat chart. The fault would be exhaling, just silently. If true, that is the better outcome. Aseismic slip means the stress is draining without a catastrophic release. Scientists cannot confirm this interpretation with current technology because aseismic slip by definition produces no signal that standard seismographs detect. Proving it requires GPS ground deformation measurements showing the surface moving in consistent small increments over days and weeks. Those measurements were being taken after April 20th. The results were not yet conclusive by the time the 72-hour advisory window closed. The uncertainty sits at the centre of Japan's current risk picture. The same flat aftershock chart that could mean a fault quietly releasing stress could equally mean a fault locked solid and loading up. From the outside, looking at the data, both scenarios produce identical results. The only event that would resolve the uncertainty, in the worst-case scenario, would be a much larger earthquake. And somewhere south, on a fault that does not care about uncertainty at all, the pressure has been building for 80 years. Imagine a rusted bolt. You turn it for months and it barely moves, absorbing each twist, each push, each increment of pressure into the metal of the threads. And then, without warning, it strips. Everything you put into it releases at once. The bolt does not ease out gradually. It fails suddenly, completely, with a snap that sends the tool flying. That is a locked fault. A locked fault segment is a section of a fault where the two plates are gripping each other so tightly that no movement is possible, even though the tectonic forces driving the plates are still operating at full strength. The energy accumulates in the rock on both sides of the fault. The rock bends and strains. The GPS stations above it record millimeters of ground deformation per year, each measurement adding to a growing total. In the Nankai Trough, the interface between the Philippine Sea Plate and the overriding Eurasian Plate has been fully or partially locked since the last major rupture in 1946. 80 years of tectonic movement have been stored in that fault. Scientists can estimate how much displacement has accumulated by measuring the ground deformation above the locked zone and comparing it to the known plate velocity. The estimate for the Nankai Trough locked zone is sobering. The accumulated slip deficit, the amount the fault needs to move to catch up with the plate's natural motion, amounts to roughly 20 to 30 feet across the deepest locked sections. 20 to 30 feet of sudden seafloor displacement across a fault more than 600 miles long is the input parameter for a catastrophic tsunami. The locked fault concept also explains why the April 2026 situation raised immediate concerns beyond the immediate aftershock data. The northeastern fault system and the Nankai Trough are not directly connected along a single fault line. They are separate systems, but they exist within the same broader tectonic environment, and major earthquakes on one system can change the stress distribution across adjacent systems. This is called stress transfer. When the April quake broke a segment of the northeastern fault, it shifted the local stress field. Models show that certain configurations of fault rupture can actually increase the stress on neighbouring locked zones by pushing additional load onto sections that were already near their breaking point. Scientists ran those stress transfer models after April 20th. The results were preliminary and came with wide uncertainty ranges, but several scenarios in the modelling showed stress increases on sections of the Nankai system as a result of the northeastern rupture. The increases were small in absolute terms. A locked fault loaded with 80 years of accumulated stress does not break because of a small additional push, but small pushes compound. And the Nankai Trough was already close enough to its historical rupture cycle that the additional modelling attracted serious attention. What that fault contains, what it can produce, and what Japan has calculated about the odds of it breaking open within the next few decades is a story that is frankly difficult to hear. But Japan has heard it. The country built its response around it, and the numbers at the centre of that response are some of the most carefully studied and most sobering in modern disaster science. Off the southern coast of Japan, beneath the Pacific Ocean, a geological clock has been ticking for 80 years. The Nankai Trough is a subduction zone that runs roughly parallel to Japan's Kii Peninsula and Shikoku coastlines. The Philippine Sea Plate is diving beneath the Eurasian Plate along this line, moving northwestward at roughly 2 to 3 inches per year. That rate is slow by human standards. Across the history of this fault, it has produced some of the most destructive earthquakes ever recorded on Japanese soil. The historical record of Nankai ruptures goes back over 1,000 years. Large earthquakes along this system have struck with striking regularity. Major events hit in the mid-1600s, then again in 1707, then in 1854, and most recently in 1944 and 1946. The gap between major cycles ranges from roughly 100 to 150 years. The last full rupture was 80 years ago. That places the Nankai system somewhere in the second half of its typical loading cycle. The plate has moved approximately 16 to 20 feet since 1946. All of that motion stored in the locked interface as elastic strain. The Japanese government's official estimate, published and updated regularly by the Cabinet Office of Disaster Management, puts the probability of a major Nankai Trough earthquake at 60 to 90% within the next 30 years. 60 to 90%. Scientists refer to this range as near certainty in probabilistic terms. For disaster planners, it is a certainty being planned around rather than speculated about. This is important. The 60 to 90% figure is not a worst-case scare scenario. It is a consensus estimate derived from historical rupture intervals, GPS deformation data, paleoseismic records pulled from seafloor sediment cores, and plate motion models. Multiple independent lines of evidence converge on the same conclusion. The Nankai Trough is going to break. The debate among scientists is about the magnitude range, the exact rupture extent, and the precise timing, not whether it will happen. The fault can rupture in sections, as it did in 1944 and 1946 when two separate segments broke roughly 2 years apart, or it can rupture simultaneously along its entire length, producing a single event significantly larger than either of the 1940s earthquakes individually. A simultaneous full rupture is the scenario that drives the worst-case modelling. Scientists call this the coupled rupture scenario, and the energy released in such an event would put it in the magnitude 8.7 to 9.1 range. That is Tohoku scale or larger, but striking a coastline that is more densely populated, more industrially developed, and in some areas less protected than the northeastern coast that absorbed Tohoku. Japan knows this. The country has been preparing for it for over a decade in a direct and systematic way that is extraordinary in scale. But preparation and prevention are different things. The fault does not consult disaster management plans, it follows its own schedule. And the details of what the worst-case Nankai event would actually look like on the ground are the subject of a modelling effort that produced numbers hard to read calmly. The number deserves a moment of honest attention. When the Japanese government says there is a 60 to 90% chance of a major Nankai Trough earthquake within 30 years, that figure is not a news headline estimate or a political talking point. It comes from one of the most rigorous probabilistic seismic hazard assessments ever conducted on a single fault system anywhere in the world. The assessment draws from several independent data sources, and each one tells the same story. The first source is the historical rupture record. Researchers have pulled sediment cores from the seafloor along the Nankai Trough and identified the layers of disrupted material left by ancient tsunamis. These tsunami deposits act as a geological diary, recording every major rupture event going back roughly 4,000 years. The dates between events, calculated from the sediment layers, produce a consistent interval that puts the current moment inside the expected rupture window. The second source is the GPS deformation network. Japan operates thousands of GPS stations across the country, some planted on bedrock, some mounted on structures, some anchored to the seafloor itself. These stations track ground position down to fractions of an inch. Over years, the pattern of ground movement above the Nankai locked zone shows the overriding plate bending steadily inward, accumulating strain at a measurable rate. Scientists can calculate how much strain has built up since the last rupture, and compare it to the strain released in historical events. The third source is paleoseismic trenching, where geologists dig across ancient fault scarps on land and read the physical record of past ruptures in the displaced soil layers. All three methods independently produce estimates that cluster in the same range, a 60 to 90% probability over 30 years. For a 30-year window, that is a higher annual probability than the chance of a major hurricane striking any given stretch of the United States Gulf Coast in any given year. Consider that comparison for a moment. The United States Gulf Coast built its entire disaster infrastructure around hurricane preparedness, and hurricanes still cause catastrophic damage when they arrive. Japan is staring at a geological event with comparable annual probability, but one that strikes without the 5-day advance warning a hurricane provides. An earthquake gives you seconds. The government publishes this number openly. It appears in official disaster preparedness documents, in school curricula, in the building codes applied to new construction, and in the evacuation planning materials distributed to coastal residents. Japan does not hide this estimate from its population. It treats the Nankai rupture as a scheduled event being planned for rather than a remote possibility being worried about. That planning has produced some of the most ambitious and expensive disaster preparedness infrastructure ever built by any government. But the scale of the threat, even against that infrastructure, produces projections that are extraordinary in their severity. Because when scientists modelled what a full Nankai rupture actually produces on the ground, they generated numbers that informed a national response unlike anything outside a wartime mobilization. 300,000. That is the number of fatalities Japanese government modelling assigns to the worst-case scenario for a full Nankai Trough rupture. 300,000 people, the equivalent of wiping out a city the size of Pittsburgh or Cincinnati, gone within hours. That number comes from a comprehensive disaster modelling effort commissioned by the Japanese Cabinet Office of Disaster Management. The modelling team included seismologists, tsunami engineers, structural engineers, emergency management specialists, and urban planners. They ran the scenarios across multiple rupture configurations, multiple times of day, multiple seasons, and multiple assumptions about warning time and evacuation compliance. The 300,000 figure represents the scenario where a major rupture strikes at night, when most people are asleep. Evacuation compliance is low because the warning arrives when people are least prepared to respond. The tsunami reaches shore before a significant fraction of coastal residents have reached high ground. In better scenarios, meaning daylight hours, better evacuation compliance, and faster warning dissemination, the modelling shows casualty numbers significantly lower. Some optimistic scenarios reduce the fatality estimate to around 20,000. The gap between 20,000 and 300,000 is a gap filled entirely by human behaviour in the minutes after the shaking starts. That is what the numbers actually say. The geological event is fixed. The tsunami is coming. The only variable is how many people are already on high ground when it arrives. This is why Japan's coastal evacuation drills are not once-a-year exercises. In high-risk communities along the Nankai coastline, residents practice multiple times per year. Children learn evacuation routes the way American children learn fire drill procedures. Elderly residents are assigned specific helpers for each drill. The 300,000 figure has been publicly discussed in Japan since the Cabinet Office released its modelling in 2012, a year after Tohoku forced a complete reassessment of Nankai risk. The number entered the public consciousness and never left. It is part of the reason the Japanese government has spent over $50 billion on Nankai preparedness infrastructure since 2012. It is also part of the reason that every earthquake along Japan's southern coastline, every anomalous seismic reading from the Nankai region, and every unusual pattern in the GPS deformation data triggers a cascade of government review that most other countries would reserve for imminent military threats. The 300,000 figure is the ceiling. Below it lives saved by evacuation and preparation infrastructure. The scientist who produced that number did so specifically, so the distance between ceiling and outcome could be filled with deliberate action. Whether that action is enough depends on a set of engineering projections that involve a completely different kind of number. The economic damage estimate for a worst-case Nankai Trough rupture is $1.8 trillion. 1.8 trillion. To make that number concrete, it is roughly equal to the entire annual economic output of Canada. All of Canada's factories, farms, banks, stores, hospitals, software companies, and natural resources producing for a full year, adding up to roughly what a single Nankai earthquake could destroy in a matter of hours. This figure also comes from the Cabinet Office modelling. It accounts for direct physical destruction, meaning collapsed buildings, destroyed roads, wrecked ports, and damaged industrial facilities. It accounts for disruption to supply chains, which in Japan's case means global supply chains, because Japan is one of the world's largest exporters of precision manufacturing, electronics, and automotive components. It accounts for the cost of emergency response, temporary housing, and the multi-decade rebuilding process. It does not fully account for secondary effects, the ripple of disruption that spreads outward from Japan's economy into global markets. Japan is the world's third largest economy. Its ports handle a significant fraction of global maritime trade. Its manufacturing sector produces components that feed into supply chains across Asia, North America, and Europe. A Nankai rupture that destroys or severely disrupts Japan's Pacific-facing infrastructure for months or years would send shockwaves through every industry that depends on those supply chains. The automotive industry, the semiconductor industry, the precision machinery industry, the electronics industry, all of them carry deep exposure to Japanese manufacturing. The disruption following a Nankai event would not be limited to Japan. It would propagate globally within weeks. Economists who model these scenarios note that the 1.8 trillion direct damage estimate is almost certainly an undercount when indirect global effects are included. Some models put the total global economic impact, direct and indirect combined, above $3 trillion. These numbers exist alongside the human toll. The economic figures are not separate from the casualty projections. They are connected. A wealthier, more functional society recovers faster and loses fewer people in the long tail of a disaster. The economic destruction and the human suffering feed each other. Japan's decision to spend tens of billions on preparedness infrastructure, on higher seawalls, reinforced buildings, better warning systems, and redundant evacuation routes is a direct economic calculation. Every dollar spent before the event reduces the multiplier of destruction afterward. But the economic damage estimate assumes the disaster happened in Japan alone. The tsunami generated by a full Nankai rupture does not stop at the Japanese coastline. When the Nankai Trough breaks open, the seafloor will lift. Across a fault length of more than 600 miles, the overriding plate will spring upward and seaward, releasing 80 years of stored elastic strain. The seafloor above the rupture zone will rise by several feet, across an area comparable in size to the state of California. That uplift will happen in seconds. The water column above it has nowhere to go but up. The resulting tsunami will not resemble the waves most people picture from a beach or a surfing video. A tsunami is a transfer of energy through the entire depth of the ocean, from the seafloor to the surface, moving as a single body of water. In deep ocean, it travels at the speed of a commercial jet aircraft, roughly 500 miles per hour, but its height above sea level is only a few feet. Ships at sea might not even notice it passing beneath them. The danger comes when this wall of energy encounters a shoreline. The seafloor rises. The water has nowhere to go but inward and upward. The wave compresses, slows, and climbs. What was a few feet of ocean-wide swell becomes a churning mass of water tens of feet tall, moving inland at freeway speeds. For the Nankai scenario, the modelling shows wave heights at the coast exceeding 100 feet in the most exposed locations. 100 feet. That is taller than a 10-story building. Imagine the tallest building in your neighbourhood, and then imagine water rising above its roof and pouring inland, carrying everything in its path. The Japanese coast facing the Nankai Trough is protected in many areas by seawalls. The largest of these seawalls, constructed or reinforced after the 2011 disaster, stand up to 60 feet tall. A 60-foot seawall is an enormous engineering achievement. A 100-foot wave overtops it. Not everywhere along the coast will see 100-foot waves. The wave height varies based on the geometry of the coastline, the depth of the seafloor offshore, and the angle of the tsunami's approach. Some areas will see 30-foot waves, others 40, others higher. The 100-foot estimate applies to specific topographic funnels, where coastal valleys or bays concentrate the incoming energy. In those locations, the modelling shows total destruction of everything at or below the wave height line. Infrastructure, buildings, seawalls, everything. This is why coastal evacuation is the primary survival strategy for a Nankai event. The engineering can reduce damage and buy time. the 60-foot seawall may reduce a 100-foot wave to a 60-foot surge at the landward side. That reduction saves lives at the margins, but the survival of people closest to the coast depends entirely on whether those people are already above the wave height line when the water arrives. And the water arrives fast. The Nankai Trough is not a random threat. It follows a schedule, not a calendar schedule with exact dates, a geological schedule, a recurring pattern visible in the historical record over more than 1,000 years, consistent enough that scientists use the word cycle without qualification when describing it. Major ruptures along the Nankai system have struck roughly every 100 to 150 years throughout recorded Japanese history. The intervals are not perfectly uniform. Some cycles ran shorter, around 90 years. Some ran longer, close to 180 years. But the central tendency is clear. This fault breaks at regular intervals, reloads, and breaks again. The 1944 Tonankai earthquake, magnitude 8.1, ruptured the eastern section of the Nankai Trough. The 1946 Nankai earthquake, magnitude 8.1, ruptured the western section 2 years later. Together, these two events released the accumulated stress from the previous loading cycle. 80 years have passed. The plates have been moving every day since 1946. The strain has been accumulating at a measurable rate. The GPS data confirms the overriding plate is bending. The seafloor deformation measurements confirm the locked zone is still locked. By the historical interval, the next rupture window opened roughly 30 years ago and continues to widen with each passing year. Scientists are careful to note that the cycle is not a metronome. The fault will not rupture precisely at the 150-year mark. But historical patterns, combined with the physical measurements of accumulated strain, create a probability distribution that peaks in the coming decades and does not offer a credible scenario in which the fault simply decides not to break. The physical reason is straightforward. The plates are moving whether the fault breaks or not. The strain budget has to balance eventually. Either the plates move smoothly through aseismic slip, which the GPS data shows is happening only partially along the Nankai system, or the locked sections accumulate strain until failure. The fraction of plate motion being accommodated seismically versus aseismically is a key measurement, and for the Nankai Trough, the seismic portion is dominant. Most of the plate motion is being stored as elastic strain. The locked fault will break. The 150-year clock is not a metaphor. It is a statistical summary of physical processes that have been repeating for thousands of years on this fault, and will continue repeating long after the current event. The question scientists and engineers have shifted their focus to is not whether the Nankai Trough will rupture, but whether the warning system, the evacuation infrastructure, and the hardened buildings will perform well enough in the minutes after it does. That warning system has components that most people have never heard of, built specifically to close the gap between the earthquake's first second and the moment a tsunami reaches shore. Beneath the streets of Tokyo, an engineering project of extraordinary scale was quietly completed over the past 2 decades. Japan built a stormwater and tsunami surge management system under the northern outskirts of the capital, known as the Metropolitan Area Outer Underground Discharge Channel. The facility stretches more than 3 miles underground and consists of 5 massive vertical shafts, each one wide enough to fit the Statue of Liberty inside with room to spare. These shafts connect via a main tunnel roughly 50 feet in diameter, running at a depth of around 150 feet below the surface. The system was designed primarily for flood management, handling the overflow from rivers that run through densely populated areas around Tokyo during heavy rainfall. But the engineering principles underlying it, moving massive volumes of water underground and away from the surface, apply directly to tsunami surge management as well. The discharge tunnel can move roughly 50 Olympic swimming pools worth of water per minute into a series of underground storage tanks and then out through controlled pumping systems. When the rivers above Tokyo overflow, the excess surges into the vertical shafts drops to the main tunnel and gets redirected before it reaches street level. This system has already prevented multiple serious floods since its completion. The water that would have inundated city streets has been absorbed underground, discharged later in a controlled manner, and the surface has remained intact. The tsunami application is more complex. A tsunami surge arriving from the coast would carry significantly more energy, more debris, and more volume than river overflow. The underground systems around Tokyo are not designed to fully absorb a major Nankai tsunami. They are designed to limit the penetration of surge water into the most densely built sections of the metropolitan area. Every metre of surge water the underground system absorbs is infrastructure that survives, a hospital that stays operational, a road that remains passable for emergency vehicles, a section of the evacuation network that holds. Tokyo's underground infrastructure is one piece of a larger defensive architecture that includes elevated evacuation roads built specifically to remain above projected tsunami inundation levels, designated vertical evacuation buildings whose upper floors are engineered as tsunami refuges, and a network of reinforced government operations centres designed to maintain emergency coordination even if surface infrastructure fails. The scale of this investment reflects the reality that for Tokyo, the Nankai Trough is not a distant geological abstraction. The city sits within potential tsunami inundation range depending on rupture configuration, and it is the administrative and economic centre of the country. If coordination capacity in Tokyo fails during a Nankai event, the national response slows. People who survive the initial disaster die in the aftermath for lack of coordinated rescue and supply delivery. Japan built the underground fortress because it understood that arithmetic. But infrastructure saves lives only if the warning reaches people in time to use the evacuation routes and the reinforced buildings. The warning system itself is a scientific marvel, and it is built around sensors that track the Earth's movement with a precision most people find hard to imagine. Japan operates the densest network of GPS ground monitoring stations on the planet. The system is called GeoNet, the GPS Earth Observation Network System. It consists of roughly 1,400 stations distributed across the Japanese archipelago. Each station is a precisely anchored reference point, mounted on bedrock where possible, designed to track its own position continuously to within fractions of an inch. 1,400 stations across a country the size of California. That density means there is a GPS station roughly every 25 miles, across almost every part of Japan, with higher concentrations in the most seismically active regions. These stations measure something that feels abstract until you think about what it represents. They measure how much the ground is moving, bending, and shifting under the influence of the tectonic forces pushing on it from below. Over weeks and months, the accumulated data from all 1,400 stations paints a precise picture of strain building up across every fault system in the country. In the Nankai region, the GPS data shows the overriding plate bending toward the subducting plate at measurable rates. Year by year, the stations above the locked zone record small but consistent motion patterns that indicate the fault is coupled and accumulating elastic strain. Scientists can calculate the slip deficit, how much total plate motion has been stored in the locked zone rather than released through earthquakes, from the GPS time series data. The GPS network also detects the ground deformation that follows major earthquakes. After the April 2026 event, the GeoNet data was analysed to measure how much the surrounding crust moved and in what directions. The displacement patterns help scientists locate the specific section of fault that ruptured and estimate how much slip occurred. More critically for the missing aftershock question, GPS data can detect aseismic slip. If the fault is releasing stress silently, without generating earthquakes, the surface above it should show steady, incremental motion in the direction of the subducting plate. The GPS stations would catch that signal even if the seismographs are flat. Scientists were looking at exactly that data in the weeks after April 20th. The network also feeds into the early warning system. Changes in GPS readings that fall outside the normal range, sudden offsets or unusual motion vectors, can trigger alerts that feed into the national emergency broadcast system. The GPS is not just a research tool, it is an active component of the warning infrastructure. 1,400 stations measuring the planet's surface to a fraction of an inch, all reporting simultaneously, all feeding data into systems designed to catch the earliest possible signal that the Nankai clock is entering its final seconds. And despite all of it, the warning that matters most still arrives only after the earthquake has already started. When a megaquake strikes the Nankai trough, the clock starts immediately. The earthquake itself will be the first signal. The shaking will last several minutes, far longer than most people have experienced. Buildings will crack, power lines will fall, roads will buckle. By the time the shaking stops, people on the Nankai coastline will have a window of roughly 10 to 15 minutes before the first tsunami waves arrive in the most exposed locations. 10 minutes. That is the evacuation window for the people living closest to the water. Japan has calculated this precisely. Emergency planners have measured the distance from every coastal community to the nearest high ground or vertical evacuation structure. They have timed the walking speed of elderly residents, adults and children under panic conditions. They have mapped the roads and identified where bottlenecks form when large numbers of people try to use the same evacuation route at the same time. The results of that analysis drove billions of dollars of infrastructure investment. Evacuation roads were widened and elevated. Vertical evacuation towers were constructed in communities where high ground is too far to reach on foot in the available window. These towers are reinforced concrete structures built to survive both the shaking and the tsunami surge, with rooftop platforms high enough to remain above the projected inundation level. In communities where the 10-minute window is genuinely impossible to meet through horizontal evacuation, the vertical option is the only option. The towers are placed so that no resident is more than a few minutes' walk from one. The calculus changes with each earthquake that damages roads and bridges before the tsunami arrives. Cracked pavement slows evacuation. A collapsed bridge cuts off an entire neighbourhood's route to high ground. This is why every Nankai preparedness plan includes multiple redundant evacuation routes, and why structural engineers prioritise keeping evacuation infrastructure intact, even at the expense of other systems. Sequential earthquakes, like the December 2025 and April 2026 events, are particularly concerning in this context. Each one tests and potentially degrades the exact infrastructure that coastal residents will need to perform optimally in the first minutes after a Nankai rupture. An evacuation route that holds up fine under normal conditions and even survives a magnitude 7 event may develop a hairline crack or a slight settlement in the pavement that turns into a full collapse when the far larger Nankai shaking arrives. Engineers cannot inspect every road, every bridge, and every vertical evacuation tower between every major earthquake. The inspection cycles are as fast as resources allow, but the earthquake frequency in Japan right now is straining those cycles. The 10-minute window is already tight under perfect conditions, under conditions where 2 major earthquakes have already run through the same infrastructure in the previous 4 months. The margin shrinks further. And the tsunami itself has a second act that most evacuation plans acknowledge, but that most people do not fully internalise. The first tsunami wave is the one everyone runs from, the one the sirens announce, the one that arrives while people are still reaching high ground or climbing evacuation towers. The second wave is the one that kills people who stopped paying attention. Tsunamis are sequences, not single events. A major submarine rupture generates a series of waves that spread outward from the source. These waves travel at different speeds depending on the depth of the ocean beneath them. The deeper the water, the faster the wave. As the seafloor topography changes approaching the coast, different waves in the sequence decelerate at different rates, and they arrive at the coastline spread across a window of time that can span several hours. The first wave often arrives with significant energy. It floods inland, carrying debris. Then it retreats. The water rushing back out to sea during the retreat is itself dangerous, pulling people and wreckage into the ocean. Then the second wave arrives, and in many documented tsunami events globally, the second or third wave has been larger than the first. This happens because of interference patterns in the wave sequence, because of energy focusing caused by undersea topography, and because of the way reflected waves from nearby coastlines can merge and amplify. Following the 2011 Tohoku tsunami, coastal monitoring stations recorded significant waves arriving over a period of several hours. Some communities that appeared to have survived the first wave were struck harder by subsequent ones. For a Nankai Trough rupture, the fault geometry and the coastline configuration of Japan's southern and central coasts produce a particularly complex wave sequence. Modelling shows multiple significant wave arrivals spread across 2 to 3 hours after the initial rupture. This means that the evacuation window does not close when the first wave arrives. It stays open for hours. People on high ground must stay there. Rescuers entering damaged areas in the aftermath of the first wave face the risk of the second and third waves arriving while they're in the inundation zone. Japan's evacuation protocols address this explicitly. The official guidance is clear that people who have reached safety should remain in place until authorities issue an all clear, which may take several hours. The psychological pressure to return to damaged homes and businesses, to search for missing family members, to assess what survived, that pressure is enormous. And it costs lives when people descend from safe elevations too early. The training and the signage and the public awareness campaigns on the Nankai coastline are built around two messages. Get up fast, stay up long. Both messages depend on people receiving the warning in time, and the warning itself faces a challenge that no amount of engineering can fully solve. Japan's infrastructure is not failing. That point needs to be stated clearly. The country's building codes are among the most stringent in the world. The reinforcement programs following 2011 brought thousands of structures up to updated seismic standards. The seawalls, the evacuation towers, the bridges designated as evacuation routes, all of them were built with earthquake sequences in mind. But engineered structures have a concept called fatigue life. Every time a structure absorbs stress, it uses up a fraction of its designed resistance capacity. A bridge built to survive 100 major earthquakes has not truly failed if it survives the first 50. It has used half its fatigue life. The next 50 events will find it with reduced margins. No engineer designs for infinite fatigue life. Every structure has a design service life, a number of years or cycles of loading that the engineering calculations assume. When earthquake sequences compress years of expected loading into months, the fatigue math changes. After December 2025 and April 2026, Japan's infrastructure engineers were running updated assessments across the entire northeastern corridor. The question was not whether structures had collapsed. Most had not. The question was how much fatigue life the sequential events had consumed and what the remaining margins looked like for the next major event. The answers are not available to the public in comprehensive form. Infrastructure assessments at this level involve complex engineering calculations that take time to complete properly. What is known is that the national government accelerated its inspection and reinforcement program following the April quake, prioritizing evacuation infrastructure first, then critical facilities including hospitals and emergency operation centers, then broader transport networks. The nuclear facilities in the region received priority inspection. Each one holds components that cannot be allowed to fail. The inspection protocols at nuclear sites following major earthquakes are comprehensive and mandatory under Japanese regulatory law. Any finding that falls outside the defined safety envelope requires the facility to suspend operations until the finding is resolved. Beyond Japan's borders, the structural question has a global analogue. Critical infrastructure around the world is aging. Most countries outside Japan are not spending at the level Japan is on seismic reinforcement. The lesson that Japan is demonstrating through its current situation, that earthquake sequences compound rather than reset infrastructure stress, applies everywhere fault systems exist. The specific lessons that scientists are drawing from Japan's 2025 and 2026 experience are already being studied by earthquake engineers in California, Turkey, New Zealand, and other seismically active regions. Every crack in Japan's infrastructure that gets caught and repaired before the next event is a lesson written in data. Every section of road that fails inspection and gets reinforced is knowledge transferred to engineers watching from thousands of miles away. But the human dimension of this ongoing seismic period is harder to measure in engineering reports. Millions of people have been living under it for months, and the effect on them is a form of damage that shows up in a different kind of data. A magnitude 7 earthquake is enough to wake you from the deepest sleep. The initial jolt arrives before you have any conscious thought. Your body processes the shaking before your brain identifies it. By the time you're fully awake and sitting up, your heart is already at full pace, your instincts scanning the room for something to get under, something to hold on to. In northeastern Japan through 2025 and 2026, that experience has happened repeatedly. Each event triggers the full physiological stress response. Each event is followed by hours of aftershocks, small tremors that keep the nervous system in an alert state long after the main shaking ends. Each event is followed by days of checking walls for new cracks, testing whether doors still open and close properly, reassessing whether the shelf above the bed is still safely mounted. Psychologists have a name for the state that emerges from prolonged exposure to unpredictable, life-threatening events. They call it hypervigilance. The brain's threat detection system recalibrates toward constant alertness, scanning for danger even when the environment appears calm. Sounds that would normally be ignored, a vibration from a passing truck, the house settling in cool night air, register as potential earthquakes. The body stays partially activated even during sleep. The physical consequences of sustained hypervigilance are well documented. Sleep quality degrades, concentration at work and school suffers. Physical health markers including blood pressure and immune function deteriorate over months of chronic stress. The people most affected are those with the least control over their circumstances: the elderly, children, people without the financial means to relocate, people caring for dependents who cannot evacuate quickly. Japan has mental health support infrastructure embedded in its disaster response system, a recognition built from the experience of 2011. Counsellors and support services were deployed to evacuation shelters after both the December 2025 and April 2026 events. Community mental health programs were activated across the affected prefectures. But mental health support addresses the symptoms of stress, not its cause. The cause is ongoing seismic risk that cannot be removed from the landscape. The fault systems are there, the tectonic forces are active, the historical record is unambiguous. The people living on Japan's coastlines are not living in fear of something that might happen once. They are living in a long, slow confrontation with a geological reality that is certain to eventually produce an event far larger than anything they have experienced so far. The psychological burden of that knowledge, layered on top of the physical experience of repeated major earthquakes over a short period, is a form of national stress that is genuinely difficult to quantify. Japan continues to function. Schools stay open, businesses operate, daily life proceeds. The resilience of the population is real and extraordinary. But that resilience is carrying a weight that grows heavier with each new advisory, each new flat aftershock chart, each new measurement showing the Nankai Trough bending a fraction further toward its breaking point. And the fault systems do not act alone. When one breaks, it can send a signal to the others. Tectonic plates do not operate as isolated systems. Every fault in the Earth's crust exists within a stress field, shared with the faults around it. When one fault breaks, it changes the distribution of stress across that entire field. Rock that was being pulled in one direction gets pushed in another. A fault segment that was sitting comfortably below its breaking threshold might suddenly find itself loaded past it. A fault that was years away from rupture might be moved weeks away. This process is called static stress transfer, and earthquake scientists have documented it extensively. One of the clearest examples comes from the 1992 Landers earthquake in California, which triggered a series of secondary earthquakes across Southern California on faults that had shown no unusual activity before the Landers event. The stress transfer from the main rupture was detectable and measurable. In Japan, the fault system complexity makes stress transfer modelling particularly important and particularly difficult. Multiple major faults exist in close geographic proximity. The northeastern fault zone and the Nankai Trough are separate systems, but they exist within the same broader tectonic environment created by the interaction of four plates. Large events on one system perturb the stress field that the other systems sit within. After the April 2026 earthquake, stress transfer models were run to assess the impact on neighbouring fault segments. This is standard procedure following any major earthquake. The models calculate how the rupture changed the stress loading on surrounding faults and whether any of those changes brought specific segments closer to their failure threshold. The models produced results with wide uncertainty ranges, as they always do. Fault geometry is known imperfectly. Friction coefficients vary along fault surfaces in ways that are difficult to measure directly. The initial stress state on every neighbouring fault carries its own set of assumptions. What the model showed, within those uncertainty ranges, was that certain sections of the fault system around the April rupture zone experienced measurable stress increases. Some sections to the north, some to the south. The magnitudes of these increases were small relative to the total accumulated stress on those sections. A fault loaded with 80 years of tectonic pressure does not break because of a small push. Small pushes matter though when a fault is already near its breaking point. A locked fault sitting at 95% of its failure threshold and then receiving a small additional stress increase from a neighbouring rupture is a different calculation than a fault sitting at 50%. The Nankai Trough's stress state puts it in the first category, not the second. This is why every major earthquake in the broader Japanese tectonic environment now gets assessed for its potential effect on the Nankai loading state. Not because any single event is expected to trigger the Nankai rupture directly, but because the cumulative effect of stress transfers across a system that is already deep into its loading cycle deserves careful tracking. Scientists are tracking it. The GPS network is watching, the stress models are updating, and the scientific community watching all of this data is increasingly divided, not about whether the Nankai Trough will break, but about what the current northeastern situation actually means for timing. Science rarely speaks with one voice. On Japan's current seismic situation, the disagreement is genuine, professionally argued, and unresolved. The core dispute centres on the April 26 aftershock data. Two camps exist, and both are made up of serious, rigorous scientists working from the same dataset. The first camp believes the missing aftershocks are consistent with aseismic slip following the main rupture. In this interpretation, the fault zone around the April event is quietly releasing residual stress through slow, continuous creep. The absence of aftershocks reflects a fault that is healing gradually and silently, rather than in sharp seismic steps. The GPS data in the weeks following the April quake showed some ground motion patterns that fit this model. This camp considers the 72-hour advisory window as appropriate caution that was correctly resolved when no larger event followed. The second camp is less settled. Their concern is that the GPS motion patterns observed after the April quake are ambiguous. The same surface deformation signatures that indicate aseismic slip can also be produced by slow fault creep in a locked zone that is adjusting around the edges of a new stress concentration. They point to historical examples where similar post-earthquake quiet periods preceded larger events by days, weeks, or months, well outside the standard 72-hour window. This second group is not predicting an imminent catastrophe. They are arguing that the data does not support closing the book on the April sequence and that continued elevated monitoring is warranted. Both camps agree on one thing. The tools currently available to seismologists cannot definitively distinguish between a stabilizing fault and a fault in a deceptively quiet preparatory phase. The fundamental limitation is that earthquake prediction remains one of the hardest problems in earth science. Decades of research have produced better understanding of fault behaviour in general. They have not produced a reliable method for forecasting specific ruptures on specific faults within tight time windows. The April 2026 situation is, in a painful way, a textbook case of that limitation. The data is real, the patterns are genuinely unusual, the historical parallels are genuinely concerning, and the scientific community cannot tell the people of Japan's northeastern coast with certainty whether the danger has passed or whether it is still building. This uncertainty is not a failure of science. It is an honest statement of where human knowledge currently stands. The Earth keeps its own schedule. The best tools ever built to watch it are still watching. And the answer to the most important question, was that the main event, or was it a foreshock, may only become clear when the ground moves again. In the meantime, Japan's government has to make public statements and policy decisions based on incomplete information, and those statements have been carefully calibrated to keep people prepared without causing panic. Japan's government has a communications challenge that is almost without parallel in the world. How do you tell 50 million people living in potential tsunami inundation zones that a major earthquake is coming, probably within 30 years, possibly sooner, while keeping those people psychologically functional, economically productive, and able to carry out daily life? The answer Japan has developed over decades is a combination of radical honesty and radical preparation. The radical honesty part means publishing the 60 to 90% Nankai probability figure in official documents and making it part of public education. It means issuing the 72-hour advisory windows when the data warrants them. It means holding press conferences where the Cabinet Office explains the missing aftershock data in plain terms, rather than burying it in technical language. Following the April 2026 earthquake, the official communications from the government and the Japan Meteorological Agency were unusually direct. Officials confirmed that the aftershock pattern was abnormal. They confirmed that the 72-hour advisory window was activated because the anomaly met the agency's criteria for elevated concern. They explained what foreshock sequences look like and acknowledged that the current pattern shared characteristics with historical foreshock events. They also stated explicitly and repeatedly that no specific prediction for a larger earthquake was possible. They did not say the danger had passed after the advisory window closed. They said the immediate elevated risk period had ended and that monitoring was continuing. The distinction matters. The government did not give the all clear, it gave the immediate window closed. The radical preparation part means the $50 billion investment in seawalls, evacuation towers, reinforced buildings, and underground flood management systems. It means the mandatory evacuation drills. It means the early warning network on the bullet trains. It means GeoNet and the 1400 GPS stations. It also means something softer but equally important. Japan has built a culture of preparation that treats disaster readiness as a normal part of life, rather than an admission of fear. Earthquake drills in schools are as routine as fire drills in American schools. Emergency supply kits in homes are as standard as smoke detectors. The cultural normalization of preparedness is itself a form of infrastructure that reduces casualties when events occur. The government's communications after April 2026 reflected all of this. The message to citizens was consistent. The situation is being watched closely, the data is unusual, the standard precautions remain in effect, and the country's preparedness systems are at full readiness. For the rest of the world watching Japan, the April 26 situation carried a message that went beyond Japan's borders, and the geological connections that link Japan's fate to the broader world are more direct than most people realize. A major Nankai Trough earthquake would not stop at Japan's coastline. The tsunami generated by a full Nankai rupture would propagate across the Pacific Ocean. Wave heights would diminish with distance, but they would remain measurable and potentially damaging thousands of miles from the source. The Pacific Rim, from the west coast of North America to Hawaii to the Philippines, would receive tsunami advisories within hours of the rupture. The historical record of Pacific crossing tsunamis confirms this. The 1960 Chilean earthquake generated a tsunami that killed people in Hawaii and Japan, both thousands of miles from the source. The 2011 Tohoku tsunami was measured at tide gauges across the entire Pacific basin, reaching the coast of California and causing port damage there. A Nankai event in the 8.7 to 9.1 magnitude range would generate a larger initial wave than Tohoku. The impact on Pacific coastlines outside Japan would depend on the rupture geometry and the direction of maximum energy propagation. For North America's west coast, the modelling suggests waves of 3 to 15 feet, arriving several hours after the rupture depending on location. 15 feet of tsunami wave is enough to cause serious damage to harbours and low-lying coastal areas. It is survivable with sufficient warning, but the warning time from Japan is limited. The Pacific Tsunami Warning Center in Hawaii, which monitors seismic events across the basin and issues alerts to member nations, would begin issuing Pacific-wide advisories within minutes of a confirmed major Nankai rupture. Beyond the immediate tsunami risk, the economic connections are even more pervasive. Japan's manufacturing capacity, its port infrastructure, and its supply chain centrality mean that a major Nankai event would immediately affect production and shipping timelines for industries worldwide. Factories that produce electronic components for American cars, precision equipment for European manufacturing, and semiconductor inputs for global technology supply chains are concentrated on exactly the coastlines that face the Nankai Trough. The disruption to just-in-time manufacturing supply chains would be felt within days. Assembly plants in the United States, Germany, South Korea, and China that depend on specific Japanese-made components would face production slowdowns within weeks of a major Nankai event. Economists who study disaster economics call this contagion risk. A disaster large enough to cripple a major node in the global economy does not stay contained at the source. It propagates outward through the connections that globalization built. Japan is one of the largest nodes in that network. This is why Japan's seismic situation is not a regional story. The fault running beneath the Pacific Ocean off Japan's southern coast is connected to every economy that trades with Japan, to every Pacific coastline in the tsunami's reach, and to the physical reality that the planet's tectonic system does not recognize national borders. The question that all of this leads to, the one that sits at the center of the entire situation, is the one that cannot be answered. And the fact that it cannot be answered is perhaps the most important thing to understand about where Japan and the science of earthquakes actually stands. Every sensor is deployed, every GPS station is reporting, every seismograph in Japan's 1400 station network is transmitting data around the clock. The world's best earthquake scientists are analysing that data in real time, and the most important question about Japan's seismic future cannot be answered. Was the April 2026 earthquake a standalone event or a foreshock? Is the fault zone stabilising or loading? Will the Nankai Trough rupture in 5 years or 30? Will it break in sections or all at once? None of these questions have answers right now. The data narrows the possibilities, the historical record shapes the probabilities, the physics constrains the range of outcomes, but the specific prediction, the one that would say with precision what will happen and when, lies beyond what current science can produce. This is not a temporary gap that will close with a few more years of research. Earthquake prediction is a fundamental scientific challenge rooted in the chaotic nature of complex physical systems. Fault behaviour involves millions of interlocking variables, rock friction coefficients that vary at every point along the fault surface, fluid pressure in deep rock that changes invisibly, stress concentrations that migrate over time, interactions with neighbouring fault systems. Even with perfect sensor coverage, the mathematical system is too complex and too sensitive to initial conditions for precise temporal predictions. Scientists have known this for decades. The research community shifted its focus from prediction to probabilistic hazard assessment in the 1980s and 1990s, after repeated failures to develop reliable short-term prediction methods. The result is the framework Japan uses today, the 60 to 90% probability figure, the historical cycle analysis, the GPS-based strain accumulation modelling. These tools are genuinely powerful for long-term risk assessment. They cannot tell you what will happen in the next 36 hours. What they can tell you is that the forces involved are real, measured, and accumulating. The Nankai Trough is storing tectonic energy right now. Every day the plates move, the locked fault zone stores a fraction more. The GPS stations above it are recording that storage in millimetre increments. The historical record says this fault has broken catastrophically many times before and will do so again. For the people living on Japan's coastlines, the unanswerable question has a practical consequence. Preparation cannot wait for certainty. The evacuation drills, the emergency kits, the knowledge of the nearest high ground or vertical evacuation structure, all of it has to be maintained in a state of readiness indefinitely, because the fault does not announce its schedule. Japan has built its response to the unanswerable question around exactly that logic. The country does not wait for a specific warning. It treats the warning as always active, the preparedness as always necessary, the risk as always present. Every other civilization living above an active fault system on this planet is watching Japan and learning. The geological forces that make Japan's situation so acute are not unique to Japan. Subduction zones ring the Pacific. Active faults run beneath cities on every continent. The tectonic system that built the land humans live on is still running. The question is not whether other faults will eventually break. The question is whether the people living above them will be ready when they do. Japan has spent decades building its answer to that question. The answer is still being tested, and the ground beneath it is still deciding what comes next.